Okay, all right, so we can start here and I'll be admitting people as we go along. But this way we won't take up too much of people's times as we get into the evening hours here. I'm so glad that people were able to join us today and that this is being recorded for those who are going to be reviewing the information as we prepare for the Envirothon of 2023. My name is Sue Quincy. I work for DEEP, Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, in the education outreach area of our division in state parks. So if you have educational questions or looking for resources, you can certainly contact me and we'll be glad to help you find any resource you might need to cover topics of climate change or other conservation and educational areas. So I'm going to turn it over to our guest speaker today, who is a specialist for our agency. He is Jeff Howard, and he is the Senior Environmental Analyst in the Bureau of Energy and Technology Policy, specializing in climate policies. And lately, if you've been listening to the news or talking amongst other people, you've heard a lot of discussion about electric, whether supply and demand are going to be there, how is it going to be provided, and all sorts of other questions that come up on a regular basis. And one of the first conversation starters is usually a question that is being used a lot as a statement is why go electric when it still uses fossil fuels? And that's what we're going to be hopefully learning about today is the understanding of electric and the advantage of going to electricity for mitigation of carbon emissions. So I'm going to turn this over to Jeff, who will help shed some light on this as he presents why electrified transportation and heating. Thank you, Jeff.
Great. Thank you, Sue. Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be here with you today. I have some slides to go through. I'm focusing on electrification of transportation and heating. I think those are the main places where we get questions about the value and validity of electrification. As Sue mentioned, I focus on. I'm actually gonna make this bigger like that, and I should be able to see it better. I'm in the I'm in DEEP's Office of Energy Supply and Infrastructure, which is in the. I didn't include on the slide. It's in the Bureau of Energy and Technology Policy. I focus on both climate change mitigation policy, much of which is a focal point for us in the Energy Bureau at DEEP. I also focus on renewable thermal energy, which we will be talking about some today, although I won't call it that specifically. You'll catch the connection. So 3 topics: why electrification, why EVs, electric vehicles, I'll use the abbreviation, and why heat pumps. And we'll talk about what a heat pump is and how it works and why it is an electrification strategy to reduce GHG emissions. So here are 4 topics under the heading of why electrification. These are the things I'm going to do in the next few slides here. So electrification is important to us as a GHG reduction strategy. So let's look at why Connecticut considers itself to have a GHG reduction imperative. GHG, as I'm sure you know, is greenhouse gas, and I will use the abbreviation pretty freely. Our Global Warming Solutions Act, which was passed in 2008 and amended in 2021, sets a number of GHG reduction targets, a couple of which have already passed, a couple more of which are coming up here. The 2020 reduction target of 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We actually haven't formally declared yet whether we have met the target, because the greenhouse gas inventory report that will make that clear is coming out this fall. So 20% reduction by 2020, 45% reduction by 2030, that was the amendment in 2021, and 80% reduction by 2050. The 80% reduction target was largely in line with international scientific advice at the time that the act was passed and initially passed in 2008. It's now a little bit long in the tooth and a little bit out of date and a little bit not as stringent as it arguably ought to be. I'm assuming you guys are not seeing photographs or images over the top of the words here. I am. I'm going to have to kind of move things around to see, pardon my pause here. So electrification is a strategy for greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So, electrification is widely recognized as a key means to address the climate challenge, to reduce energy related greenhouse gas emissions. It is seen as a strategy that can address fairly broad swaths of the economy. It can't be applied to everything, but it can be applied to a number of challenges, decarbonization challenges that are otherwise fairly difficult. And one thing it does, and I'll emphasize this as I go through, is that electrification exploits the inherent efficiency of electrical applications. We'll get some data on that as we go. Electricity use, of course, does not involve direct emissions of greenhouse gases. So your toaster does not emit greenhouse gases. And the indirect greenhouse gas emissions from use of electricity, in other words, the electricity or the emissions from power generating stations, those indirect emissions can be virtually eliminated by decarbonizing the electricity grid. And that of course is something that Connecticut and a number of other state jurisdictions and a number of countries around the world are aiming quite seriously to do. Decarbonization of the grid will require that we have more zero carbon resources, more solar, more wind, especially offshore wind, and more fuel cells. It will require us to have fairly extensive storage of electricity in batteries, in what's called pump storage, which actually isn't storing electricity, it's storing potential energy that can be converted into electricity, and other forms of storage. It'll also require us to do a lot more of something called active demand management, which we do some of now, but not nearly as much as we will need to do. Connecticut, like all of the jurisdictions in the Northeast and quite a few across the country, are actively pursuing all of these approaches. I will also have a slide near the end where I will argue for you that electrification actually will facilitate decarbonization of the grid. Electrification of some key uses of energy will actually help us make the grid cleaner. So we do have, of course, as you are probably well aware, we have in the wintertime in New England, an electricity crunch, I will call it, where we don't have, where we have a competing use for energy resources. Right now, the peak electricity consumption in New England from regional grid is in the summertime, primarily from our extensive use of air conditioning. But as we electrify our heating, we are expecting the shift in the peak consumption to shift to the winter time, because we'll be using a lot more electricity for heating than we currently are. And so we expect that annual peak to begin to occur in the summertime in the years ahead. But for the winter crunch, the main problem at this point is the limited availability of fossil methane, I call it. Natural gas is the normal term there. I use fossil methane because we're primarily using fossil form of natural gas. We're not using renewable natural gas much at this point. So in the wintertime, what happens is that our homes and businesses, when the weather gets really cold, on the coldest days of the year especially, we use a lot more natural gas to keep our homes and businesses warm, which means that there is less methane available to run the still largely natural gas-fired power generating plants. So there's a competition between those two, and the way that the regulations work, the homes and businesses win out, and the electricity has to do something else. That something else almost inevitably is dirtier than natural gas. So there's some coal burning plants will come online at that point. Some plants will be burning oil, etc. All of which is, from a carbon standpoint, dirtier than natural gas. So this crunch in the winter time that we will be creating will in large part in the early years be from a competition for who gets to use the available natural gas or fossil methane. We will be alleviating that crunch, or seeking to alleviate it, by expanding the zero carbon resources that are available on the grid, and by expanding our use of active demand management. Active demand management means that the utility is able to throw a switch or toggle an algorithm and get some uses of electricity to shut down temporarily to minimize the strain on the grid. Some of those in the future may be in your home. Intriguing and perhaps disconcerting possibility. The zero carbon resources, in case it's not clear here, in this second bullet here, those would be the more solar farms and wind farms and so forth. And I'm going to pause in a couple minutes or shortly here for some questions you may have already. So beyond the winter time crunch that occurs, there was sort of a broader crunch that we can anticipate with the shift to electrification. For things that are currently not electrified, we're going to be, if we're converting into electricity, we're going to be using more electricity to cover that energy demand. This electrification then will shift demand from fossil fuels to electricity more and more. And it will require more electricity to be generated than it currently does. In our integrated resources plan, it's a strategic planning process that DEEP goes through every few years. The conclusions were that we have multiple pathways available to us in Connecticut to achieve a zero carbon electric sector in the years ahead. That, by the way, that target for a zero carbon electric sector is now enshrined in state law. The IRP, this plan also indicates that it is critical that we prioritize affordability and equity. It emphasizes the need for storage. Pardon me, that was not what I intended to do, for storage of electricity and for demand management, which I mentioned a minute ago, and those will need to play increasingly significant roles. It points out that the existing transmission system, the wires and towers and transformers and so forth that move electricity around, that system will need to be upgraded and expanded. And it points out or argues that we probably will need the Millstone nuclear plant in Connecticut, which is one of the few remaining nuclear facilities in New England, to remain online past 2029, which is when its operating permits begin to be phased out. And I think at this point, I will pause to see if you have any questions.
Yeah.
Before we talk about EVs and heat pumps.
Okay. Well, I think the first question that came up related to the EV, so we're going to hold off on that one before, so you can get into it. But I know that is a big concern. And there's a couple of questions that, or areas that I think might need a little revisiting. And one was for the crunch, the energy crunch, and our limited fossil methane of resources. You had mentioned the active demand applications, and that they were disconcerting to some, possibly. How is that, and what are those exactly?
It was a throwaway line. It shouldn't be disconcerting because in fact the active demand management isn't something like a rolling brownout. That's an emergency measure. Active demand management is planned, strategically structured, voluntarily engaged in arrangements between the utility and a utility customer to curtail some particular use of energy during a particular range of hours, typically 2, 3, 4 hours at a time.
So is it something that technologically would reduce the draw in your house so that it's just humming for your refrigerator, so to speak, but not everything else? So it's a lower volume of electricity going out?
Or as we'll talk about, it might be meaning that you don't charge your EV during peak hours. I mean, it may be structured that way as well.
Okay.
So it may not be turning something off, but it may be avoiding the use that you can defer to another time of day.
Okay, so those are options that are being worked on, planned, but
yes,
some flexibility.
There are existing programs, and the programs will be expanded, is the expectation.
Okay. We had a second question that our had set into the chat, and where are these zero carbon resources going to be placed in the state, since so much land is held privately? And I know the land use issue is a big one that is addressed at the Envirothon, because it is a focus on resources and resource use.
Yes. Yeah, it is definitely becoming more and more difficult to site projects on land, public or private. The big expansion of zero carbon resources that Connecticut is engaging in, and that most of the other states in the region are engaging in, is offshore wind. So large turbines placed at some distance from shore, barely visible or not visible at all from shore, situated in places that will do minimal impact on shipping and fishing and so forth. Remarkable amount of energy available from that kind of facility. So Connecticut has already purchased, or has agreed to purchase energy from one development that is getting underway, and more developments are anticipated in the coming years. And all of the other New England states are doing this as well. Massachusetts, New York. New York is not New England, but New Jersey, New York, and on down into the mid-Atlantic states. All of these states are rapidly moving toward significant new zero carbon resources offshore.
Okay, and that goes back to your point of the decarbonizing of electricity is more possible when the source of energy use is electricity, as opposed to oil or coal or other fossil fuels creating the electricity.
Yes. So there are other kinds of low carbon resources, things like biodiesel and so forth. Those are harder to do in the region where we are, and harder to do at scale for broad application.
Okay. I'm going to take a quick browse and see if we have other questions in the chat. If anybody does have a question, by all means, you can unmute yourself and ask it. Well, I'm checking here, because I know we have two that are coming up that are in the queue on EVs. So why don't we just go ahead and start with EVs at this point?
Great. Thank you. So why EVs? We'll review transportation GHGs, greenhouse gases. I'll do a quick little poll. We'll talk about EV efficiency and EV greenhouse gas emissions, and we will talk about what's called the EV roadmap in Connecticut. So transportation GHGs. Transportation is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Connecticut. About 37% in our latest official state inventory of GHGs. That was from the year 2018. The 2019 inventory will be coming out this fall. It's the one that will tell us whether we met the 2020 target or not. There's a long lag in the development of those inventories. They require a lot of data that has to be gathered at the national level, at the regional level, and then allocated by EPA. So there's a 2 to 3 year lag typically. Transportation emissions have not dropped much at all since 1990. They're just, it's dismaying. They're largely where they have been since 1990. And that is the case even though our cars have gotten a lot more efficient during that period. That 32-year period, cars have gotten a lot more fuel efficient, but in Connecticut, as in other places, we are driving a whole lot more miles than we used to. And the net result is that the GHG emissions attributable to our driving have really not reduced. So let's take a quick poll, and we can do this either verbally or by show of Zoom hands. How many of you drive a hybrid electric vehicle?
And if you are raising your hand, you need to be on camera or use a gesture.
Yes, there we go, like Susan has done there. So one hybrid. Let's go on to if you lower your hand there, Susan, and let's ask the next question. How many of you drive what I call a straight EV, meaning a completely battery operated electric vehicle? Anybody? Okay. How many of you expect to shift to an EV, a straight EV, let's say, the next time you purchase a car? Anybody? So Susan, you expect to shift from a hybrid to a battery electric vehicle next time around. And Sue, we got two Sues up here, Anna Virginia, and a Karen, expecting to go to EVs the next time around. And I don't know how many others are online at this point. Sue, I don't know if anybody's left to say expected.
We have, I think, I can't see my little number, but I believe we have 8.
Okay. Anyone else expecting to shift to an EV within not the next purchase, but the next 20 years? I see Kyle's hand maybe disappear, maybe up for the first time now. Okay. If Connecticut has anything to say about it, you will get more and more opportunity, shall we say, and more market incentives to purchase an EV the next time you buy a car. And Connecticut officially would like to see almost all of you, or many more of you, and your family members and friends and colleagues purchasing EVs or shifting to EVs in the coming 10, 15 years. So why do we want to do this? Well, one of the reasons is that EVs are inherently more efficient than internal combustion engine vehicles, whether those are gasoline or diesel powered vehicles. Well, I'll be paying attention to passenger vehicles here, but the same basically applies to other vehicles as well. So a gasoline powered vehicle, well, an EV has efficiency of around, you look at the bottom right of this second figure, this 87 and 91% of the original energy in the electricity is going into moving the vehicle forward, as opposed to about 60 to 25% in a gasoline powered car. So dramatically more efficient just mechanically. Much of the, and just think of how much heat your internal combustion engine vehicle produces under the hood. All of that heat is lost energy, that is wasted energy. Another factor here, well, we can see some. I'm having a hard time finding a place to park images so I can actually see the screen. We see some other numbers here, some additional numbers. And it's saying here, if you are charging your EV with electricity that is produced with coal, you are still reducing energy use by around 31%. If you're charging your electric vehicle with electricity produced with natural gas, you're reducing energy use by about 48%. And even if it's pretty clean electricity produced with hydropower, you're still reducing your energy use relative to, I mean, your value is even better, of course, because that electricity is cleaner. And you're going to have like a 75% reduction in energy use relative to gasoline-powered vehicle. So the bottom line here is that even the dirtiest electricity on the planet produced with coal will still result in a 31% reduction in the amount of electricity needed to move up the vehicle. And the batteries, as the little quip on the bottom left shows, the battery, extra battery that an EV also requires electricity to manufacture, of course, but it's a relatively small amount, and that doesn't change the big picture here. How does all that stack up for greenhouse gas emissions associated with these vehicles? Here's some simple numbers here. This is for Connecticut. On the left hand side here, you see what the assumptions are about what is going into Connecticut's electricity. Most of it is this brownish, reddish brown color natural gas. The next biggest chunk is nuclear. So given that mix, that grid mix, as it's called, of where the energy is coming from that is powering vehicles today, here on the right-hand side, you see how the GHG emissions compare a gasoline versus a hybrid versus a plug-in hybrid versus an all-electric or battery electric vehicle. A dramatic reduction in the GHG emissions associated with the transportation that those vehicles supply. The Connecticut EV roadmap, which came out in 2020, provides recommendations about how to expand, how Connecticut and its businesses and its public policies should proceed to expand the deployment of electric vehicles. So there are recommendations about public and private fleets. So corporate fleets like the FedEx trucks, for example. Actually, that would be a medium and heavy duty vehicle. So the private fleets, I think, we're referring to passenger vehicles. So imagine a company like Travelers has probably, I don't know, 15, 20, 30 vehicles that are available for employee use. That is a private fleet. The public fleet are vehicles owned by municipalities or owned by the state. And those all together, those public and private fleets are a fairly large number of vehicles. So there are policy recommendations about how to kind of move those fleets toward an EV posture. There are recommendations for those medium and heavy vehicles like postal service vehicles, delivery vehicles, even heavy duty on-road vehicles. The recommendations about improving the public charging infrastructure. So we're seeing charging stations built at public rest stops along highways. We're also seeing publicly available charging increasingly available in places like town hall parking lots, gas stations, etc. Some of the gas stations in the Hartford area are offering EV charging for a fee. There's also recommendations here about residential, workplace, and fleet charging, trying to make it easier for people to charge at home, charge when they're at work, and get those fleet vehicles charged. There's attention here to what it's like for customers to find a charging station, use a charging station, interact with the software at the charging station, handle any payments that are necessary for charging, etc. Making that experience better, less bulky, and more seamless. There are recommendations as well about how to minimize the impacts of the EV charging has on the grid, and the recommendations finally about building codes and other kinds of permits that are needed so we can get EV charging available in places, make it easier to install in your home. So when one of the moves here, for example, is when a new home is built, it should be pre-wired for an EV charging station in the garage. Even if the charging station itself is not part of the original package of the house, the wiring that permits that should be available, and the electrical panel should be capable of handling that. And that brings us to the end of the EV section. So again, let's open it up for some questions here.
Okay, I'm going to go back up here to the top. And this was from Lori, is how are batteries and EVs going to hold up in the winter, especially in the northwest corner where it gets really cold with wind chill? Will this shorten the life of batteries, and will the EV cars even start when it's cold?
They certainly will start. The cold weather does not, my understanding is that the cold weather does not harm the battery. It does make the battery less efficient. It means that your range is reduced on those coldest days.
Okay. And what are the environmental concerns associated with mass production of batteries to support a massive shift from fossil fuels to electricity-driven vehicles?
Yeah, good questions. And as you probably know, one of the key questions in that general category is where will the minerals needed to produce all of these batteries come from? And there is the federal government is now making some concerted efforts to improve the availability of those minerals within the borders of the U.S. so that we are less dependent upon foreign nations to provide those minerals or batteries made with those minerals. Of course, mining has environmental costs, but for every cost there is in mining minerals to make electric vehicle batteries, there are also environmental costs to mining of oil and mining of natural gas and mining of coal. So at some level of analysis, we have to recognize that we are proposing basically to shift from one kind of environmental impact to another kind of environmental impact there. That doesn't mean that the environmental impacts that we're moving toward are something we should discount or not pay attention to. We certainly need to do that and have an obligation to do that. But it's not like battery EVs cause kinds of harm that other kinds of energy, other kinds of transportation do not. So.
Okay. Okay, and there was some statements and discussion about getting into the EV versus the hybrid when you're asking the polling and questions. And what is, or this is my question from that, is there a big savings from transfer from a hybrid as like your stepping stone to complete EV? Or is that eventually going to be a lost step for us here in Connecticut?
I think you're asking in part, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're asking in part whether the hybrids will remain a market option.
Yes.
I suspect so, but I really don't know. I haven't seen forecasts on that. So I don't know, honestly, if that's the case, but I wouldn't be surprised. I would be surprised if they're not available for some time to come, because I think there is. My guess would be that there is recognition of a need to help people ease into the EV market, and that the hybrids, the plug-in hybrids, are useful ways of kind of allaying people's concerns, getting them accustomed to the technology, familiarizing them with the fact that many people find EVs fun to drive, etc.
Right. And is there, I'm going to skip to Susan Michael's question and then go back about condos. Is there a possible market for fuel cell vehicles, or how would adding on to that the hydropower option be formulating?
Okay, let me take the fuel cell first. Yes, fuel cell vehicles are, and I've done a sort of a shorthand version of the EV here. Fuel cell vehicles are regarded as electric vehicles in most contexts. So fuel cell takes hydrogen and converts it to electricity, and that electricity runs the vehicle or runs something else in an industrial or commercial setting, for example. So then the vehicle, if it has a fuel cell, is going to have a tank of hydrogen, and that hydrogen will be carried around like gasoline is carried around now. There are some challenges associated with that, as you can imagine. But yes, we do need to regard fuel cell vehicles as EVs. One critical caveat about fuel cell vehicles is that currently that hydrogen comes almost entirely in the form of natural gas. It is natural gas that the fuel cells strips the hydrogen from, and then uses the hydrogen and discharges the rest of the hydrocarbon, the rest of the hydrocarbon into the atmosphere. So there are carbon dioxide emissions from the fuel cell currently. The promise is, and the fervent hope is, that we will find ways of making so-called green hydrogen, which would be hydrogen manufactured without fossil fuels. So hydrogen manufactured through electrolysis of water, where you split the water, you capture the hydrogen, you emit the oxygen, and the hydrogen then has a lot cleaner environmental profile, and is closer to something that would be comparable to a battery electric vehicle in terms of the environmental profile.
Okay. And going back here to Kyle's question about EV cost at the moment is a pretty high consideration. And do you know of any steps that are being taken to make EVs more affordable for average consumer? And
Absolutely.
I'm going to add on to that too, especially the equity issue of people that are below average financial consumer.
So Connecticut, like a number of states, offers at the very bottom of this screen, you see the CHEAPR, the cheaper logo. This is the program through which Connecticut makes rebates available to people who buy either new or used EVs. Those incentives are fairly substantial. In addition to that, there are now federal tax credits, I believe they are. Maybe just some outright rebates in as well. I'm not familiar with all the financial angles there, but federal incentives are I think currently available, still available, and more. We expect that with the federal incentives that are going to be incoming, and we expect with the continued downward movement in the sticker price of EVs, that the equation there will be shifting decisively in favor of EVs in the not too distant future.
Okay. And what about permitting codes for apartments and condos, going back to the housing, especially with concerns of fire and with the batteries?
Well, even before you get to the fire question, the condos and apartment buildings, it's a tough nut to crack. The best practices now, beginning to appear in building codes in some places around the country, are for the owners of these buildings to require a certain number or proportion of EV charging facilities on the premises for people who live there and don't have a garage or don't have property that they specifically own and so forth. That is, as I say, the best practice. And this EV roadmap proposes, I think, if I remember correctly, it proposes pushing that kind of conversation along in Connecticut so that it happens more on the ground in Connecticut than it currently is. The fire question, I don't know what to make of it. My sense is that the incidence of fires related to EV batteries for passenger vehicles has been the incidence of that has been fairly restricted to some very specific make and models, and in fact, even narrower than that, to some specific battery manufacturer and battery models. My educated guess is that the manufacturers recognize this as an existential challenge, and that they have to get a handle on it, and that they're putting great resources into fixing those kinds of problems, so that they don't occur even as often as they had been, and they haven't been occurring very often. I mean, I know quite a few people who have electric vehicles, and I've never met anybody who has personally involved in a vehicle battery fire. Where it is more challenging, and it's more concerning to me, the larger vehicles, the buses that are electric. We've had some incidents even in Connecticut with bus fires, and I honestly don't know what the prospect is there, or what the trajectories of intervention are. I don't know what to make of it. It flummoxes me.
Okay. How do EVs hold up when involved in vehicle accidents then?
I don't have any personal knowledge of that, I'm afraid.
Okay.
As far as I know, I'm not aware of any significant issues there.
Okay.
That's all I can say.
And question again, back to the repair and maintenance costs. How do they compare for EVs and gas-powered cars? If you could clarify that a little.
Well, the EV maintenance costs are extremely low compared to ICE cars. So there's not oil to change even. There aren't injectors to get clogged. There are just many fewer maintenance items on the list of things you have to do with any regularity, and they tend to be very inexpensive. So people who buy EVs for environmental reasons are often just shocked at how little they actually have to pay to keep the vehicle up. There just aren't that many items on the checklist.
Okay. Okay, well, I think that clears the chat questions. If I missed anyone's question or if other things have popped into your mind, could you just add them or speak them out? And then we'll move on a little bit.
I have one question. Because the cost of batteries is quite significant when you go to replace it. Do you think the state would ever have, a special like savings account that maybe wouldn't be taxed, that people could put money into, so when it does come time to replace the battery, it wouldn't be such a shock? Because I can't imagine people are saving all this money and putting it someplace in anticipation of a large battery purchase, and this maybe would help that.
Yeah, my depth of knowledge on EVs is not great, I have to confess. I don't have a good working understanding of the longevity of the battery, at what stage of the car's life it will need to be replaced. I recognize it is a concern. It's something that's rattled around in my head, but I have not managed to collect any actual data on the question. I don't think I have heard that issue is addressed. I don't think I've seen that issue addressed in the EV roadmap either. So I don't know how salient that question or that issue is in policy circles at this point. My guess would be that it will become a more salient issue the more EVs we have on the road, and the longer they are on the road, and the longer we have personal experience with them, the more pressing that issue is likely to become. That's my crappy answer.
Okay. Well, Lori did add, I don't know if you saw in your chat, but she had heard it was usually like 5 to 7 years is what they had said in discussion. So that could become an equity issue. And something that would have to be planned for once it starts to grow in numbers. Yeah.
So I guess it may come down to how long do people actually keep their cars. Yeah, it's complicated. It's an important point, and I wish I had a better understanding of it.
Okay.
Should we go on to heat pumps?
Yeah, let's go see a heat pump.
All right. So why heat pumps? We'll talk about thermal, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with thermal use of energy. I'll do a quickie poll again. We'll talk about what a heat pump is. We'll talk about heat pump efficiency and heat pump greenhouse gases. Whoops. Yes, we're going to start with thermal GHGs. So in this big pie chart, the wedges in orange and kind of peach color are the thermal ones. So thermal use of fossil fuels. This is heating use of fossil fuels in our homes and businesses, and in some cases in industry as well. There's some other industrial emissions that aren't in that category. Those are over in that non-fossil fuel wedge on the other side, the gray. As you can see, the thermal wedges together are also on the same order of magnitude as the transportation wedge. Very substantial. Transportation was 37, thermal's 33%. I said that the transportation emissions haven't come down since 1990. Residential thermal emissions have come down somewhat, about 8.4% since 1990. Commercial thermal emissions have not come down. They've actually gone up 13% since 1990. But even the 8.4% reduction for residential, that is nowhere near being in line with the statewide GHG reduction target for 2030, or 2050. We have to start getting commercial emissions down, and the residential emissions have to reduce at a much more rapid rate than they have been in that period. the reductions that we have seen in the thermal emissions, to the extent we've seen reduction in thermal emissions, that reduction has come primarily from shifting from fuel oil to natural gas. So we've shifted from a dirtier fuel to a somewhat less dirty fuel. So we've kind of squeezed some GHG benefits out of that conversion to natural gas, but there's not a lot more that we can squeeze there, and we're certainly not going to be able to get to the 2030 and 2050 targets statewide if our thermal emissions are not reduced more dramatically than natural gas can achieve. So, a quickie poll. Raise your hand if you own a heat pump. Anybody?
Susan, Michael, and Lori.
Okay, I'm not. I guess. Oh, I'm sorry. I've got the images off the screen, so I can
see your image.
So 2 people own heat pumps. I'm going to say I'm going to hazard a guess that the rest of you who aren't raising your hands are wrong. That you do own a heat pump, and you just don't know it. Heat pumps include your refrigerator. They include your window AC unit. They include your central AC unit. They include the AC unit in your car. If you have a chest freezer or a deep freeze of some kind, that is a heat pump. So a quick kind of very lay explanation of a heat pump is that it doesn't produce heat. It's not like a toaster. It instead uses electricity to move heat from one place to another. And if you'll think about it, that's what your refrigerator is doing. It is using some electricity to locate heat in your refrigerator or in your freezer or in your house and move it out. It moves it from one side of a wall to another side of the wall. It doesn't produce cold. It seems like it does, but it doesn't actually. What it does is it locates heat in places you don't want it, and it shoves it out into a place where you don't care that it's there. So it's taking it out of the box and moving it, taking it from the inside of the box and moving it outside of the box. What we typically call heat pumps, and what you folks had in mind when you either raised your hand or didn't raise your hand, was an air source heat pump or a ground source heat pump or a water source heat pump, which are specialized machines like the ones you see being installed in this faint image behind, to harvest heat from the environment in the wintertime and then send heat back into the environment in the summertime. What they were installing here is an air source heat pump. It looks like a typical air conditioning unit, and it essentially is a typical air conditioning unit, except it can operate, unlike an air conditioning unit, it can operate in 2 directions. So it can do both heating and cooling, or cooling and heating, I should say. So there's air source, there's ground source. That's where you have a loop of piping underground, either in a vertical well or in a horizontal loop that is just under the surface, or a water source where you're actually using a lake, a stream, a river, a pond, the ocean, as your heat source and heat sink. As you can imagine, a ground source, and in most cases a water source heat pump is more efficient than an air source heat pump, especially on cold days or very hot days, because the environment from which the unit is taking heat, or which is trying to expel heat, is much better suited for the occasion. So the ground stays roughly 55 degrees in Connecticut year round, And so getting heat from that 55-degree soil is substantially easier and more efficient than getting the same amount of heat from air that is 30 degrees or 20 degrees or 10 degrees. And heat pumps, the last bullet here, that heat pumps can be used for space heating and space cooling, meaning space heating the air inside our homes and businesses. It can be used for water heating, can be used for refrigeration, and it can be used for industrial processes. So there are industrial scale heat pumps that the two guys could not pick up like the two are doing in this photograph. They would weigh many tons. They can be adapted for those heating and cooling needs on an industrial scale. The efficiency of a heat pump, just as electric vehicles are inherently more mechanically efficient than internal combustion engines, heat pumps are inherently more efficient than their electric and their fossil fuel fired counterparts. So an air source heat pump normally, or most of the time, would be about 3 times more efficient than resistance heating. Resistance heating here means like your toaster. So it's like an electric furnace, which we don't have many people in Connecticut who have electric resistance heating. There are some, but not many. They're much more common in warmer climates. You'll find a lot of resistance heating. It's extremely inefficient. Air source heat pumps are at a minimum 3 times more efficient than that on a regular basis. And the more efficient the heat pump, you get into a ground source heat pump that is more efficient than an air source heat pump, and you're looking at 6, 7, maybe even higher times more efficient than that electric resistance heating. But cold climate air source heat pump, even an air source heat pump, which is inherently less efficient than a ground source heat pump, even the air source heat pump, if it's designed for use in a cold climate, is still going to be 60 to 80% more efficient than an oil-fired boiler, or 70 to 80% more efficient than a fossil gas fired boiler. So those combustion processes are just inherently less thermodynamically efficient than a heat pump is. Even an air source heat pump, much less a ground source or water source heat pump. So you see some figures at the bottom there of the kinds of improvements you're going to get when you shift from one kind of heating to a cold climate air source heat pump. Greenhouse gases, as you can imagine, are dramatically reduced when you have those. So you'd have to kind of mix and match these efficiency numbers, with the previous numbers that I showed you about the greenhouse gas intensity of different kinds of grid resources to get these. But you can imagine here that the greenhouse gas emissions associated with electricity used by heat pumps are significantly reduced. So this report, these are numbers from 2018. They're a little old at this point. My guess would be that they're a little more pessimistic than maybe would be warranted today, but I haven't crunched any numbers to confirm that. But this report estimated that in order for the residential heating to be brought into line with the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, or greenhouse gas reduction targets set in the Global Warming Solutions Act, we would need about 11% of the residential heating load to be converted to heat pumps, cold climate heat pumps, by 2030 to meet the 2030 target. And the comparable number for commercial was 9%, and there it's on a square footage basis, but a comparable kind of number. That's all I have at the moment for heat pumps specifically. I do have one more thought, but let's take some quick questions here on heat pumps before we move on.
Okay, I'm going to ask anybody if they do have a question. You can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask it. I have a quick question. Is the use of the cold climate air source heat pump being implemented? Is that the primary goal here in Connecticut for switching to electric?
It's one of the main strategies. The reason that air source heat pumps and cold climate versions of air source heat pumps are getting quite a bit of priority, policy priority, is that they are less expensive than the ground source heat pumps. A ground source heat pump system, because it has that ground loop, it requires wells or it requires excavation in the yard, and technology and equipment being installed in the ground, has extra costs attached to it, and so it is pricier at the outset. It's much more efficient and uses a lot less energy over time. And the people who install these ground source systems argue that in the long term they are the better technology, even from just a cost standpoint. But that's a 20, 25, 30-year proposition there to recoup. So it's kind of a steep hill to climb for some people, for many people. And so the air source heat pumps seem on that kind of scale to be a more readily and more widely deployable technology, even though they're less efficient and less rapidly reduce the GHG emissions.
And would it be more feasible for ground heat pumps to be used for new construction? Because some existing construction would not allow the wells and such space for digging.
It is more challenging with existing with many kinds of existing buildings. Yes, not all, but many. There are now companies that are specializing in close quarters, small yard kind of applications with existing buildings. But yes, in general, it's going to be easier and less expensive to install a ground source heat pump with a new building. You do have more options that way, and wider latitude and lower cost of application.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and move on and take questions at the very end? We're running a little long, but that's okay. I think it's all valuable here.
My last thought before we go to any kind of further questions you have is this. I intimated in one of the first slides that I think we can make an argument that EVs and heat pumps actually facilitate decarbonization of the grid. And I wanted to have a slide that kind of came back to that thought and tries to nail it down a bit. So the two basic kinds of moves here are that we can structure the use of EVs and heat pumps to minimize the impacts that they have on the grid. The amount of demand the amount of expansion of the grid that is needed to accommodate the peak use periods. Now we're reducing those annual peaks and reducing those seasonal peaks in demand from the grid is a really key factor. And both of these technologies, EVs and heat pumps, can be deployed in a way that minimizes their impact on this peak demand. So we can charge an EV during an off-peak time on a daily basis, and if there was an especially severe summertime or wintertime demand on the grid, you can imagine the utilities developing programs that would encourage you to voluntarily not charge your car on a particular day of the week or something when they're expecting really intense grid demand. And similarly with heat pumps, we're seeing the emergence of programs to encourage people to voluntarily do preheating or pre-cooling of their building outside of the peak demand times, so that the units can then, and the building can kind of coast through the peak without drawing more electricity. And the second move we can make here is to make these devices be deployable by the grid as grid resources. So there's quite a bit of interest and some active efforts to develop EV battery systems that would allow your vehicle to serve as electricity storage for the grid. So the grid, under some arrangement and some financial arrangement, you would get compensated for this. You would allow your EV battery to be tapped by the utility to pull more green electricity into the grid during peak hours. And the comparable thing with the heat pumps is that the technology is emerging now and coming to market where the heat pump actually has thermal storage built into it, so that it can be deployable in that same way. The utility, again, with some voluntary arrangement, with some financial inducement for you, would be able to shift your heat pump into a mode where it was drawing upon the thermal storage unit rather than from the grid for some period of time. And that, I think, is it. There is my email address in case anybody wants to reach me afterward.
Okay.
And I will be happy to take questions at this point. If you're not exhausted.
I know we don't have any in the chat, so if there's anyone that has a question crossing their mind, feel free to express it. And you can also contact Jeff directly afterwards if questions pop in as well.
Sure.
I have to say, Jeff, I think I see a judging future for you when the Envirothon comes up.
Uh-oh. I've done it. I've stepped in it.
Yeah.
Sue, I think we're done.
I think we are. Oh, here's one. Are there promotional campaigns being planned for any of these programs?
Oh yes. You will find if you go to the cheaper CHEAPR website, you will find the EV incentives, the state incentives there. There may be some information there, I'm not sure, regarding the federal incentives as well. But you're talking about promotional campaigns, I guess, in the form of advertisement and social media and that sort of thing. I hope. We do have on Energize CT, which is the utility run efficiency program set of programs, Energize CT, and there's a web page for Energize CT. You will find lots of promotional materials and consumer guidance on heat pumps there. I should have included a URL. I will put the URL. I'll put the URL for that in this slide deck before it's posted.
Okay, and hopefully we'll be also including the integrated resource plan access where we can find that.
Yes, there are links throughout this PowerPoint presentation. You'll find the source or data source listed quite a few times.
Okay, excellent. Well, those will be highlighted with the resources for teams to access on the Envirothon website. So thank you, Jeff, very much for helping us understand the whole issue around electricity and possibly starting some more questions about new things that we are learning about from you. And again, if anyone is looking for further information on resources and when the challenge scenario comes out, keep looking at your Envirothon website pages and we'll keep you updated. Next training opportunity is November 5th, and that is the soils training, which will take place at Sessions Woods. So again, thank you everybody for your time this evening, and I hope that you found it helpful. And I definitely did, since I'm going to have to buy a furnace pretty soon. So, hey, thank you and good night, everyone.
Good night.